This conference will now be recorded.
Hello everyone. Good evening to all in one present here. So myself Anup. So I'll be the host for today webinar. So Technomechanics present a webinar on petroleum industry outlook post COVID-19. Sara, you can move to the next slide. Hello. Hello, Sara. Can you please unmute yourself? Yes. So yeah.
Yes.
Today we have yeah. Today we have our guest speaker is Sara Boustani. She's a 24-year-old Lebanese petroleum engineer who graduated on a distinction list with a minor in mathematics from the Lebanese American University in Lebanon. During her academic career, Sara worked with the many companies as a petroleum engineering intern and served the local MUM in many leadership positions. In 2019, she was assigned the Secretary General positions for the International MUM held in New York UN headquarters. After her graduation, Sara joined Vantage Drilling as an operational engineer on her graduate scheme. During her latest experience, she was the first and the only woman working offshore on board in a drill ship TUX drilling in Lebanese water. Yeah, thank you. So now I would like to hand over the session to Sara. Yes, you can go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes,
All right. I'm assuming
we can.
that yes. Okay. Okay. Thank you for this introduction and thank you for inviting me for this webinar. So you already know today's webinar will discuss the petroleum industry post COVID-19. So nothing too technical, like business and economic side of the industry. And I think this is really interesting because coming from an engineering background, as I just said, you cannot fully understand the industry as a whole by just knowing its technical aspect. You need to have the basic knowledge about its markets and what affects the market. So I hope this will be beneficial and interesting for you guys as well. Now, I'm not really sure how much you know about business and economics in general, but I'm gonna start basically with the basics. It's gonna be simplified just to make sure we're all on the same page, and then we'll take it from there. All right, so first for the outline, we'll start first by discussing the oil and gas market in general. So basically what affects the market and what causes fluctuation in the prices in the market. And then we'll move to talk about COVID-19 and the market. So how COVID affected the market. And here we'll mostly talk about the oil market more than the gas market. Now, although basically they've both been somehow hit and affected by COVID-19, it's actually the oil market that has been that has actually taken the serious hit and the tougher hit, and you can actually hear that all over the news as well. So we'll probably more be focusing on the oil market. Also, I think for us to be able to assess possible recovery pathways, we need to understand what led to the situation that we are currently in right now. So we'll go back a few months in time just to see the effect of COVID-19 on the demand for oil, on the oil prices as well. We'll talk about OPEC, Russia, USA, oil price war, and then we'll move to just briefly and in a simplified way explain why WTI crude oil prices dropped below zero. Then we'll basically move to talk about the impact and consequences, and finally the recovery and the challenges of the market, and if it's actually possible for the market to recover from the influence that COVID-19 has left on it. We'll basically end this presentation with a small part that I was actually asked to prepare on how you guys as students can basically take this time to prepare for what could be coming next. So I hope you guys enjoy the presentation. So we'll start first with the oil and gas market in general. And this basically applies to every type of commodity. So we're talking about any market. Prices are usually influenced by two things. So here we talk about supply from one side and we talk about demand from the other side. Supply actually means how much is available. So how much are we actually producing? And demand means how much is needed. So how much is actually being consumed. And we can definitely link the demand with the growth of the countries. So if we have countries that are economically growing, we'd expect them to have a higher demand for oil in specific. Now, usually when it comes to oil and gas, we can easily relate supply to exporting countries. So basically countries that are producing that oil, and demand to importing countries, countries that are buying that. To maintain usually a stable market and prices, and this is basically the aim, is to always keep prices stable. We have to try to keep a balance between the supply that we have and the demand that we have. Because in the case where supply was much higher than the demand, then we would basically be overflooding the market with that specific commodity. So there's more of this thing than the world actually needs. And this will cause a crash in the prices, so a huge decrease in the prices. On the other hand, in case demand was much higher than the supply, then there is less available from that commodity than is actually needed. Okay, so we would consider in this case this commodity as being much more precious than it could be, and this will cause an increase in the prices. Now, when we talk about oil and gas and some other commodities as well, geopolitics also play a very important role because it can directly affect the supply, especially if we are talking about oil exporting countries or countries that are basically producing that oil. Now, when we say geopolitics, we actually mean the relationship between the countries. So if we have any wars or any conflicts, because in their part, these wars and conflicts can actually hinder the supply or the transportation of that supply to the market, which can somehow create an uncertainty in the market. An example would be if we had a conflict in the Middle East, for example, and in an oil-producing country, sorry. So in this case, we're no longer sure if that country will still be able to supply the market with the amount that it used to give to the market before. So the prices of the oil would definitely go up simply by virtue of supply or transportation being disturbed or hindered. And we've seen this happen plenty of times before, mainly in Iraq, for example, in 2003, when US invaded, we actually saw a huge increase in the prices, and you can actually see it as well in the slide in front of you in the red circle. Just mentioned before, weather conditions can also be a factor affecting the market because similar to geopolitics, they can also directly influence the supply or the transportation of that supply. Okay, so moving on from that idea, it's very logical to say that the aim of any importing country when we're talking about oil is to get basically the amount that they need in the lowest cost possible. And on the other hand, the aim for exporting countries is to sell as much as possible with the highest possible profit. Now, the market, however, is actually shared because I don't just have one producing country. We have more than one oil producing countries in the world. And that leads to competition between the countries because then importing countries would have more than one option to choose from where to buy the oil from. And this causes a problem because the producers will no longer be able to gain this much profit trying to sell that oil. And I'll give an example to clarify. If, for example, country A has the option of buying oil from either country B or another country C. If country B offers $50 per barrel and country C notices that, then country C would offer $45 per barrel. And then country B would go back to offering $40. And we'll keep on getting lower and lower and lower in terms of price until we end up selling that oil to country A for a very low profit. So we have one of the two countries did not gain anything, and the other country that actually sold the oil sold it for a very low profit. So in order to avoid this situation, as a solution for this, we created what we call alliances to be able to maintain market stability and to be able to keep the profits for all of the countries. And when I say alliances, I actually mean OPEC, for example. OPEC stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It was formed in 1960 and basically holds 13 countries, and it's led by Saudi Arabia. What they do basically is they simply just agree all together to adjust their supplies to the market so they can keep the prices stable and keep their market shares stable. And in that case, everyone would simply be gaining.
Hello?
Hello, Sara. Hello, Sara. Can you speak? Hello. Guys, I think we are having some network issue from Sara's side, so just let's wait.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can hear you. Yeah, you can go.
Okay, so I'll take it from where I stopped, which I assume was like half a minute before. All right, so I was talking about creating alliances in the market to be able to maintain the market stability and in this case keep all the profits. And what I actually meant by alliances was basically OPEC. OPEC stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and it was actually formed in 1960, where basically we have 13 countries led by Saudi Arabia. And what they do basically is they agree all together to adjust their supplies to the market so they can keep, in this case, the prices and their market shares as stable as they can. And all the countries in this case would still be gaining profit. Now, what do I mean by adjusting supplies? It basically is controlling the production. So controlling how much they're offering to the market in terms of supply. Now, as we said before, to keep the prices stable, we have to maintain balance between the demand and the supply. And since we do not directly have control over the demand, we can just simply adjust the supply depending on the demand level. And this is what OPEC actually does. Now, before 2014, the market, the oil market, was basically controlled by OPEC, which is formed from these 13 countries, and Russia. And they basically had together some sort of an alliance. It was actually kind of a verbal agreement to work together in controlling the supply to keep the market stable. And that was actually called OPEC Plus. So when we say OPEC Plus, we actually mean OPEC, Russia, and 9 other countries such as Mexico, South and okay, that was basically before 2014. So what changed after that was basically the shale revolution that happened in 2014 with the US. So US developed a new technology that allows them to produce from shale feasible and basically feasibly and economically. Okay, so they'd be able to produce from shale in commercial values and just simply sell them. Okay, so in this case, they're simply producing shale oil and gas as well. Basically, the technology was a combination of hydraulic fracturing and the directional or horizontal drilling as well. And we can see how important the shale industry is for the US from the picture that you can see in the slides as well. They're actually producing from 7 different fields, shale oil and shale gas. Now, when this happened in 2014, USA flooded the market with shale oil, and thus it gained a part of OPEC and Russia's shares in the market. And this is what created some sort of a problem between the countries. So that's it basically for the oil and gas market. Just a brief introduction to be able to understand how COVID affected the market, and this is the part that we're gonna move to right now. So what was the effect of COVID-19 on the market? First, basically, we'll talk about how it influenced demand of oil and prices of oil as well. So because basically of COVID-19, factories and industries shut down, airports in cities faced lockdown as well. People just simply stayed at home. So basically, we had a reduction in the use and the need of fuel for transportation, for energy, for manufacturing. China, which was basically the biggest oil importer in the world, went on lockdown as well, and this hugely affected the demand of oil. So as you can see in the graph right now, this led to a clear decrease in the oil demand. The ones after June are actually speculations. And usually what should happen in this case to face the situation, because you have a decrease in the demand, to balance out, we should have basically reduced the supply so we can keep the price stable. So what actually happened was something different. In March 2020, OPEC countries organized a summit in Vienna so they can basically discuss the current market and how to basically respond to the decrease in the demand. So they decided to cut the production by an additional 1.5 million barrels per day. They had already cut around 2 million barrels per day early January, trying to face the decrease in demand due to COVID-19. So they decided to cut by an additional 1.5 million. So in this case, they keep the market stable and all producers can keep earning profits. So when that happened, Saudi Arabia asked Russia to do the same thing. But instead, Russia decided to increase production by 300,000 barrels per day. And we'll discuss why that happened in a bit. Now, with demand going low and supply increasing because of Russia's decision to increase the production, in response to that, basically Saudi Arabia simply just slashed the prices of its oil exports by $6 to $8 per barrel and announced that it will increase production by 2.5 million barrels per day. So as we said before, we have lower demand and we have an increase in the supply because of Russia, and now we have an increase of supply again because of Saudi Arabia wanting to increase production as well. This causes what we call a glut in the market. A glut actually means supply of oil much more than what is actually needed, so a very high supply. Okay, so when this basically happened, the market faced oil prices crash. As we have much higher supply than we have the demand, the prices were definitely decreased. And this was witnessed significantly in the month of March. As you can see in the graph shown in the slides, Brent crude oil price reached around $24.7 dollars per barrel, and WTI crude oil dropped to around $20.5 per barrel. Now, the question basically that anyone would normally ask here is, what was Russia's purpose in doing so? So since basically by increasing production and increasing the supply, and basically we have already a lower demand than usual, oil prices would drop, and that will affect Russia too, because eventually Russia is still selling its oil, right? So what was Russia's purpose? It's actually somehow complicated. Now, Russia first claimed that they will maintain their production because, unlike Saudi Arabia, the weather conditions do not make it easy to reopen wells that have been shut in, as oil would make it would be somehow not freely flowing, so it would make it much more difficult for the well to flow. Now, of course, that was just a bluff, and the reality is a little bit more complicated than that. So what actually Russia wanted was to take advantage of the situation by knocking US producers of shale oil out of the game and just directly attacking US's shale oil industry that is somehow already fragile and already in debt. And we'll talk about this. So this is kind of a deja vu because, as I said, the most important thing to note in the slide is the shale revolution that happened. US used to import oil before the shale revolution, but now just takes part from Russia's market share since it started producing the oil after 2014. So this oil prices crash that happened right now is a deja vu because we've seen it before in 2015 and 2016, and the strategies behind them both is actually similar too. So let's try to elaborate more on the strategy by comparing one major difference between the countries. Now, in both Saudi Arabia and Russia, the operations are usually controlled by nationalized companies, and these companies are themselves controlled by the government and usually funded and supported by the government as well. Now, in the US, however, these operations are conducted by private companies, and they're not funded by the government in case these companies go bankrupt. Larger companies such as Chevron and Exxon in United States, for example, will probably not shut down for sure, mainly because they can sustain themselves in terms of budget. And even though they had already seen a decrease in their stocks, it's actually the smaller companies that would mostly be affected. So by increasing the production, as we said, the supply to the market is also increased, and that will lead to a drastic drop in oil prices. And yes, the global decline in oil prices will hurt Russia and KSA as well, but it will mostly affect the US's shale industry. And here we basically explain how does that work. It's simply because the cheap oil will no longer make it profitable for small private companies to produce in the US. So we have a huge decrease in the price, and they're still paying a lot to be able to produce. So they're no longer making profits by producing that oil from the shale. So they will simply just end up shutting down because they'll become bankrupt unless the government decides to provide some sort of assistance. Now, on the other hand, Russia already knows that it's capable of sustaining itself, well, at least for the short term, because truthfully speaking, Russia's economy highly depends on oil exporting. Okay, so it won't be able to sustain itself for a very long time, but it can at least bear the losses on the short term. As for Saudi Arabia, it can easily bear losses and would benefit regardless, even if US companies shut down or if Russia was not able to sustain itself. Now, Russia's reasoning basically failed to consider a few important points when it chose not to cut on production. First, basically, that shale oil production can easily be wound down and then boosted again. And then in this case, US shale producers will simply leave the market when the prices are low and return whenever the prices go back again. Now, it's not as easy, but it's not as hard as some would also think. Second of all, it actually did not expect Saudi Arabia to increase production too, right? So it only suspected that it will be the only one increasing the production, but Saudi Arabia responded with a decrease in the price and an increase in the production, causing a huge crash in the oil prices, much more than what Russia had anticipated. Now, these two reasons, along with threats from the US to withdraw US military support from Saudi Arabia, forced these countries to cooperate and agree basically to cut oil production. And that happened in early April, I think around 10 April, when they both decided to cut production around 9.7 million barrels per day for the months of May and June. And it has been also, I think, extended to July. From these 9.7 million barrels, 5 barrels would be cut by Saudi Arabia and Russia on its own. So that's what basically happened with the oil market and why we had very low oil prices for quite some time now. Now I'm sure, or at least hope that you've all heard about negative WTI oil prices that happened at the end of the month of April, and that actually happened even before, even after the agreement to cut down the production has been made. So if you can notice here, as you can see on the graph, only WTI oil prices went below zero. They actually reached minus $37 per 1 barrel of oil. But the Brent crude actually remained positive regardless. So why did that happen and what does it mean? What's the main difference between WTI and Brent oil, and why did WTI drop below zero while Brent just simply stayed between $20 per barrel? Now, to be able to understand this, we'll first need to know the difference between WTI and Brent crude. They're both basically what we call oil benchmarks. Because oil can be found in different regions around the world, they basically have different compositions, different qualities. So these benchmarks were actually created to act as a reference price so we can compare values of different crude oil based on some specific criteria. We have three main benchmarks, Brent, WTI, and Dubai and Oman. They're all different in specific criteria. Brent and WTI are the most common ones, but most of the contracts around the world are actually with Brent and not WTI. Now, what's similar between Brent and WTI crude oils is that they are both relatively what we call light oils. Light oils mean they actually have a high API gravity, so they are less viscous, and this is actually a positive thing, right? So it's a higher quality of oil when we have a higher API gravity. And as you can see from the table, Brent crude has 38 API, WTI has 39.6 API, so they're both relatively high, and that's a good thing. And also, basically, they're both somehow considered as sweet oils. Sweet actually means they have low sulfur content, and this is also a good thing. So in terms of quality, they are both very good oils, with WTI crude having basically a little bit of a better quality than the Brent, because they have lower sulfur content and the higher API gravity. Dubai oil is actually much heavier and has much higher sulfur content. Now, the main difference between Brent and WTI is basically the location of extraction. While Brent crude oils are actually extracted from offshore reserves in the North Sea, WTI oils are extracted from land reserves in the US. So this actually means that while Brent can easily be transported and stored in ship oil tankers, so they basically have multiple delivery points in this case, WTI oils, it's actually a different story. So what happens to WTI crude oil is that they're usually transported from the land rigs via pipelines to Oklahoma. And in Oklahoma, there is a town that's called Cushing, where basically the oil will be stored until it's delivered to a final consumer, or in this case, a buyer or the importing country. Now, following an increase in production and a reduction in demand, as we were saying, the WTI oil that was reaching the storage facilities in Cushing was actually very high. And the facilities were already filled because no one wants the oil delivered when there's basically no need for it, or it basically won't be used. So it was all more than the facilities were actually designed to handle. Okay, so we had already reached around 81% of storage capacities by April 21st. So we almost had full capacity utilization. No one's buying the oil anymore, and there's no more space to actually store that oil. So concerned with this idea of facilities being completely filled with nowhere to store that oil, WTI prices dropped to minus $37 per barrel, and countries were literally being paid to take the oil because of insufficient storage capacity. Now, this is actually a simplified version to be able to understand negative prices. In reality, it's a little bit more complicated than that and depends on something that we call future contracts, which is beyond this discussion. But please do look it up if you feel interested to know about it more. Now, what does this actually mean? Okay, so we have negative WTI crude prices, but does this actually mean that we will also be paid to buy that oil? we will actually be able to use basically gas in the cars just for free. Well, actually, that's not the case. It doesn't happen this way. It does not mean that we'll all be paid to buy the oil. And that's basically because governments will probably not pass on any benefits to the consumers, well, at least not to the large extent. Governments will most probably benefit from this profit that they gain, being given the money to take the oil, simply for trying to offset the current economic losses that affected the country due to the pandemic. Okay, so we'll move basically to talk about the impact of the decrease in the prices of oil due to COVID-19, first on countries' economies. Now, the maximum burn will definitely be faced by small oil producing countries, such as Iran and Iraq, Brazil, basically because low oil prices, at these low prices of oil, they will not be able to sell with profit. Now, the problem is aggravated even further if their economies are highly dependent on oil, because in this case, they do not have enough money to be able to sustain themselves, even on the short term. So unlike KSA and unlike Russia, for example. On the other hand, oil importing countries that have been witnessing some sort of an industrial or economic growth, such as India, China, Japan, they will most probably benefit from that cheap oil because they used to pay a lot of money to get that oil, and now they're paying much less to get that oil because it's actually cheaper. So they'll be gaining some sort of profit by reducing their expenses. And this will cause a positive effect on their economic growth. They might also start actually considering improving their storage facilities, because right now they can buy the oil at cheaper rates and store it for later use. Okay, moving on to the impact of these prices on private companies and businesses. Struggling companies and businesses that have been hit badly by COVID-19, mainly airlines, logistics companies, they'd probably benefit as well from having cheap oil because, as we said before, this alleviates one of their major expenses, which is paying a lot to get that oil. Now, due to the lack of storage capacities, shipping companies would profit as well because, as we said, we are no longer having places to store because of the high supply. So we're using ships now to store oil in them. So these shipping companies would be profiting from using their ships for storage and then towing them into the sea. Manufacturing companies will also be able to produce at cheaper rates for them, but that will also directly not affect the consumer, similar to not having free gas at the pump. So it's only something that manufacturing companies will benefit from and not the end consumer. Okay, now we talk about the impact on the environment. So with having basically cheap oil prices, it will most probably become much less costly to just produce new plastic instead of using recyclable plastics, and that will probably not have very positive effect on the environment from one side. Now, from the other side, when it comes to the environment, we actually see the question of energy transition being posed a lot. And I think the answer to this, of whether we will actually see some sort of an energy transition, will depend on what countries we're actually talking about. So first, for oil importing countries, for example, these countries will not have any economic incentive to move to cleaner energy, mainly because if they used to pay a certain amount of money to buy that oil, okay, and they were considering moving towards renewables as well, now basically the oil is much cheaper. So it's much better for their economy right now because it can sustain itself in any way. And it's much just simpler and cheaper to to buy that oil that is cheap and just not have any economic incentive to move to cleaner energy. For oil exporting countries, however, these countries would start noticing the volatility of the oil prices, simply because we can see the effect how one simple country can just cause a huge influence on the prices in the market. So they might actually start considering not staying fully dependent on the oil, mainly because of its high volatility in terms of prices, and they'd move towards investing somehow in cleaner energy by adding renewables to their energy mix. Now, for some companies, some countries, sorry, US, for example, to face the job losses in any industry, okay, they might actually consider alternatives. In this industry, for the oil and gas, mainly the oil here, they might turn as well to renewable sectors if capable, so they can try to create more jobs as well. Okay, so this is the question that's usually asked if oil markets will ever recover. Simply with just oil and gas still supplying affordable energy, and with the lower prices right now, it will definitely remain in the market for decades. It's just way too important to fail, and it will be a long time before we actually start talking about renewables substituting oil. Now, the recovery of the markets, yes, markets will definitely recover, and this recovery would depend on first reopening of the economies, and then the demand for oil going back up, and that's directly related to the reopening of the economies as well. It's actually related to the timing, the manner, and the speed at which economies would be reopened. Now, we have already seen some encouraging signs in the demand, as the demand is edging up, especially basically as countries right now ease lockdown, start getting back on track. Mainly China, India, for example, these countries are huge oil importers, so they cause a huge increase in the demand, which will cause also a price increase to $30 or $40 per barrel, as we can see right now, whether it's Brent or WTI. Now, in the near future, we might actually have what we call a temporary price spike, and this is somehow similar to what's happening right now as the countries reopen due to increase in the demand, and we actually have a limit in the supply because we're cutting on production. So this might actually cause a shock in the demand, which would by itself lead to a price increase, as we can see. Now, it's also estimated that the industry would probably improve until the end of 2020. We already started seeing some improvements, but nothing significant until the end of 2020. Global supply chain probably will also not improve until 2021, and oil prices wouldn't completely recover until 2021 as well, and that's actually the best case scenario, where we're considering crude prices to stabilize between $50 and $60 per 1 barrel of oil. Now, industry might also have to wait until 2021 to see global oil demand going back to the numbers we had before COVID-19, or basically going to around 100 million barrels per day. Now, two things can actually hinder this recovery, and that's actually mainly we're calling them challenges in this case. So first of all, if the government can actually ease this lockdown without sparking a resurgence of COVID-19 outbreaks, because if actually faced again with an increased number of COVID-19 cases, countries might actually go back to lockdown, and this will cause a crash in oil demand again and a crash in the price again. That's one of the main challenges that we're concerned about. And another basically would be about OPEC Plus being able to maintain the agreement. And in other words, basically, if OPEC, Russia, USA will be able to comply with the agreement regarding cutting the production. So these are basically the challenges that could hinder the recovery of the industry. And that's it basically when it comes to talking about the market, the prices, what actually happened, and the possible recovery pathways. Now we'll just move on to a brief section that I was asked to talk about as well. And that's basically what you guys can do as students in preparation for what's coming next and for the future. So you're probably just staying at home right now, but the worst thing that you can actually do is consider this period as a break and not take advantage of it. So yes, it is time for social distancing, but also for social networking. And it is the time for you to meet people and professionals that have been long in the field that you're interested in, and basically connect with them to try to exchange knowledge and learn from their experiences. And for me, basically, the best way to connect and build a network is through LinkedIn. It is just direct, it's professional, and simply just used worldwide by everyone. So if you do not have an account, make sure you create one right away. And if you do already have an account, make sure that yours is updated and you're actually active on LinkedIn. Now, just briefly regarding LinkedIn profiles, you need to make sure that it includes some specific factors. First, basically, a professional picture, and it should be a recent one as well. Make sure you also include a brief and a clear title about your current work position and company. So it should definitely not be 2-3 sentences long. Just keep it concise, a few words related to your biggest accomplishment. Do not list all of your previous positions. So if you're simply just an undergraduate student, for example, at University X, then the title can be Engineering Student at X University. If you have something more impressive to say, for example, you were an intern in an important company, or you're president of an SPE chapter in a university, then you can mention that in your title. So your title would mostly be about, would be something like intern at X company, or president of SPE chapter at X university. All right, so make sure it's just concise and straight to the point. And in the picture in the slide, you can actually see it. It's as simple as this. So marketing graduate of Miami University, sorry. And the picture as well is professional. Now for the summary section, make sure to include a summary as well. Ideally, this section should include 1 or 2 small paragraphs. Do not go more than 250 words. Just resume your work experience and projects. You're free actually to provide here as much details as you would like, but I personally just prefer summaries that are concise and straight to the point. Try to focus on how you provide value to people, as opposite to simply just telling them about the great things that you have done or the great things about you. Now, in the experience section, make sure you do not just mention the title and the company. You have to elaborate on your responsibilities, on the duties, and what you did while you were working with that company. And I actually took a screenshot of the experience section from my LinkedIn profile, working as an operations engineer for Vantage. As you can see, I just detailed as much as I can about my responsibilities working in the company. Now, the skills section, you have to make sure to add both soft skills and technical skills. Okay, do not miss on on any of the skills. You have to include teamwork if you're good at it, basically time management, public speaking if you're good at it, Microsoft Word, Excel, coding, all of these you can actually include them in the skills section. Most importantly, do not leave the accomplishment section empty. Make sure you include the languages that you know, the project that you've worked on, if any, online courses that you've possibly taken. You can also include test scores, especially if these scores are actually impressive and important tests like SAT and IELTS and TOEFL as well. And finally, make sure that you follow pages of companies and people that are related to your field and that could be of interest to you, so you keep on getting their updates. If you'd like to see just a sample profile, you can check my profile as well. My name basically is written on the slide as well, and this is how I write it on LinkedIn. All right, so it's also the time for you to become more knowledgeable about the areas where you think you actually lack, so you can work on yourselves. Try to take online courses, and these could be technical ones like courses about drilling or oil and gas operations. And they can also be more like general ones, mainly Excel courses, coding, project management, and so on. You can actually find plenty of courses on edX or Coursera, for example. Online webinars are also a new trend, and similar to online courses, speakers would share information, exchange knowledge in more of an interactive way, however, which can make it even more interesting. So keep checking for online webinars. You can actually find plenty every day. Okay, last but not least, we know this period has witnessed companies just going to minimum manning and a large number of people getting released from their jobs. If we think it through, the industry will eventually start recovering. And I don't just mean the oil and gas industry. I'm talking about any industry that has been affected by COVID-19 will eventually start recovering. Maybe it won't reach what it was before that quickly, but at least it will become close to it. And then new people will actually be needed in these companies, and the companies will start hiring again. So you need to make sure that these companies have your resumes with them once they decide to start doing so. So please do not stop looking and applying for jobs and internships in all of these companies. And this actually brings me to briefly talk about resumes. Make sure you spend enough time updating your resumes and make sure they are as detailed as possible. Your resumes should actually look something like the one that you see in the presentation right now. And they should include, of course, your name, detailed contact information, your title, and a brief description about your experience and what are you actually looking for. For students and recent grads, the first section should actually be your education, since that's your biggest accomplishment. And that's basically including your degree, university, the location, and possibly the GPA, depending on what your GPA is. Now, the work experience section should include internships, part-time jobs, and similar to LinkedIn, just make sure you give detailed bullet points about your responsibilities for each position. If you've done volunteer work before, make sure you include those as well in your resumes. Also similar to LinkedIn, in the skills section, you should include both soft and technical skills, and you can either basically split them up into different sections as shown here, or just combine them both into one as well. You can add important projects that you have worked on while you're in college or during your internships, and that you basically think are relevant to the experience that you're applying for. Languages are also important, so make sure you add those along with the level of competency for each. And one last point, just try to restrict your resumes to be 1 page long and not more, because especially now, as recent grads, you want HR people to just try to see and read as much as they can from your resumes. And if they feel it's too long, then probably they won't be very excited and motivated to do so. So just try to keep them restricted to 1 page long. And also just keep in mind that resumes act as a first impression. So yes, they are very important. Just put all your efforts in that. Finally, basically just make sure you stay involved in everything. So keep yourself updated with the latest information about your field, what could possibly affect it. Keep checking the news and keep attending online webinars and online courses as well. And in other words, just make sure you don't leave yourself in the dark and use this period wisely for your own self-development as you prepare for what's coming next. And that's it for me. Thank you guys for listening.
Thank you, Sara, so much for your excellent presentation. So yes, we can have now questions. Okay, so guys, if you have any question, then you can ask in the chat box. Okay, then we will get back to it. Sara, we have one question from Iman Redan. He's asking that I understood the concept behind a negative value, but how is it possible? You also mentioned future contracts when talking about negative values. Can you give an idea about what are these?
Right. We mean negative values in terms of WTI.
Yes, I think he's mentioning your WTI.
Oh, all right. Okay, so basically there's some sort of usually a misconception about negative value items, because negative value items, they actually do exist. And I'll just give a simpler example here. Garbage, for example. If you take, usually what we do at home is we take garbage out of the house and we place it in a box outside and just pay a company to come and pick it up. So mainly because first it would require a lot of storage capacity if we leave it in the house, and second because its properties would just degrade with time, right? So it will literally stink at the end, and it doesn't have any store of value, so it will not retain some sort of purchasing power in the future. So what we just do basically is we pay a company to come and pick it up and deal with it themselves. So the same thing basically happened with the oil, basically because it's not something you just buy and hold. Okay, so we paid because we no longer have storage facility for it, and its properties can easily degrade with time, and also it does not have a store of value, then we just ended up paying companies and countries to take that oil. And this is basically what negative values mean. Now, relating, the second question was related to future contracts.
Yes.
Right. Okay. This is actually some sort of a complicated concept, but simplifying it in a way, future contracts are similar to pre-ordering. It's like a contract to trade an amount of oil at a specific price that has been predetermined in a specific point of time. Okay, and this sort of things cannot be done otherwise, because we have a high price volatility. So it's like we're telling the producer how much to produce, and we're guaranteeing a predicted profit on it. Now, before the contract expires, you can sell that contract if you do not want to pick up the oil physically at the time of delivery. So if, say, for example, I do not have enough storage capacity, but I already have a contract, I can sell that contract so that the oil will not be physically delivered to where I am. Okay, as long as I do it before.
What am I telling is, can we go for a small trip, Shillong?
Hello.
I'm sorry, I did not hear that.
Yes, sir. Yes, you can continue. I think it was some.
Okay. Okay, as I was saying, if we do not have enough storage capacity and we already have a contract and we have a time where the oil we know will be delivered, I can sell that contract before the time expires for the contract. In this case, I would no longer have to physically pick up the oil. Now, these contract holders, as I said, would then in this case have to sell out of the contract before the end date if they do not have any place to store. If you hold the contract, for example, that ends tomorrow, and now, right now, with the current situation, everyone knows that there is no demand for the oil. So no one will basically rush to buy the contract from you because they will simply just be storing the oil. Okay, and they already know that we might be facing issues with the storage. So on the contrary, people would be expecting you to pay so they can get the contract. So we couldn't actually find any solutions for this, and that caused reduction in the prices. So we can try to get rid of the oil because no one is buying the contracts, and we no longer have places to store the oil. Well, I hope that was a little bit of a clarification. It is somehow of a complicated just way of understanding it.
Okay, yeah. So we have one more question from Rebecca. He's asking that was the gas market affected similarly as WTI?
Okay. Gas market?
Yes.
Okay. So we also saw basically a decline in the natural gas demand. First, basically because we did not have very cold winters this year, and then with COVID-19, we had further hit in the demand because we had lockdowns and reduction in the economic and manufacturing activities. So we actually had a demand shock for oil, for gas as well. But regardless of this, I think the natural gas industry and the market so far has experienced much less severity in terms of the impact that COVID had when we compare it to oil, and mainly because primarily the use of this gas is for electricity generation rather than transport. So even the lockdowns that had already happened, they had a smaller impact on the demand for gas in comparison to oil. Now, basically for in terms of recovery, it would also recover similarly to when basically how oil is recovering gradually, okay, and as the shutdowns are actually being lifted, and prices would recover as well, but also similar to the oil industry, not basically anytime soon near the prices we had before COVID-19. And one thing that I think can affect the gas industry basically is and how fast it can actually recover is basically how much investments we're willing to put in natural gas value chains, and that would also depend on investments in renewables, because countries that used to invest in renewables before will still have to get energy from somewhere, and they probably won't be able to right now afford renewables in the current economic situation. And they, as I said, they still have to get the energy from somewhere. So if they compare oil to gas, and since they're both cheap right now, they would probably prefer to buy gas instead because it's the cleaner type. So in this case, cutting back investments in renewables could actually help gas as well, and so on.
Yes, thank you. So we have one question from Mitchell Rehayem. So he's asking if WTI crude oil is better in quality, how is that in the slide blend was shown to be more expensive?
Can you please repeat the question?
Yes, he's asking that if WTI crude oil is better in quality, how is that in the slide blend was showing to be more expensive?
Okay, that's actually a nice question. Okay, so crude oils are usually, as we said, they're extracted from US, so they're mostly shale oils, right? And we already said that they're light and soft oils. So they have low API and low sulfur content. Now, the thing is, before this revolution, America or US basically used to get the oil from Canada. Okay, and these oils were somehow heavier. So the refineries in America, in the US, they're kind of designed to process heavy oils. Okay, because as I said, prior to the shale revolution, the refineries used to process oil coming from Canada. Now, once we started producing this light oil, this caused serious problem to the American market because it was simply just not prepared to be able to, absorb this supply of light oil that we have. And just trying to equip refineries with new equipment to be able to recover this crude oil or to just process this crude oil has actually basically proven to be somehow too expensive. So instead, US started thinking about trying to export this American crude oil to relieve as much as they can from the market from this oil towards other European refineries. So this is why they reduced the price, so European refineries can actually take that oil and just process them in Europe, because we don't have facilities that are capable of doing so in the US. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, yes. So guys, we will take only one question now, okay? And if you have any other question, then you can mail Sara. So I request Sara to share her mail ID in the chat box, or I will give you in the WhatsApp group, okay? So yeah, the last question is from the Anurag Bora. He's asking that what's your view on the future of gas hydrates? Hello, hello Sara, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah. Okay. You're
Yeah,
asking about
Anurag
gas
Bora
hydrates.
is asking.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly.
I think basically when we talk about gas hydrates or any sort of an unconventional way of producing, whether it's gas or oil, not just gas hydrates, it's always a question of if we're basically capable of affording it and how much will we actually need for us to break even in amount of price. So if, for example, it's right now for us right now, if we don't have enough technological advancement to be able to produce gas hydrates in commercial values and to be able to sell it with prices that will allow profit for the companies and for the countries, they probably won't come anywhere near starting to actually produce from gas hydrates. Now we know we already have projects that are working on gas hydrates, and the reasons why basically they are working on it now is because for them it is commercially viable, right? So they're paying a lot of money to be able to produce it, but at the same time they're selling it for very high prices. With the current, I think low prices of gas, it'll probably become even harder to focus on gas hydrates for the time being. We have very low prices. We're paying a lot of money to be able to produce the gas from gas hydrates, and at the same time we're still not getting enough profit for it. Okay, so it could similarly be hit. So I think for the time being we won't be focusing a lot maybe on gas hydrates, basically because if we take it from the economical side of view, it's not that feasible.
Yes, so thank you very much. So yes, so thank you everyone for joining this webinar. So we will be coming with some more webinar in the future. And if you have any more question, then you can connect with Sara in LinkedIn. Or Sara, can you please drop your mail in the chat box?
Yes, of course. I can send you my email, and I'll send you my LinkedIn profile. You can contact me there as well. And thank you so much again for having me.
Thank you. Guys, we will also share the feedback link with you. Okay, I request everyone to fill the feedback form and let us know on which topic you want the next webinar to be. Okay, so this is the feedback form. Yes. Thank you, everyone.